Over the years, since 1971, when the Conservancy of course was set up not only to manage the Harbour Authority but also manage for nature conservation as well, lots of different projects for the protection of nature have taken place.
The years leading up to the formation of the Conservancy were of course the 1960s, and this was a time of great change. More and more people had more leisure time. They had transport, they had cars, they wanted to go sailing, and they wanted to live by the harbour as well. This was the time when the marinas were built and more homes were built for the visiting yachtsmen. One of the big projects at the time was here at Thorney Deeps, and that was an application to turn it into an amenity tip. One of the big proposals during the 1960s was to build a barrage at the entrance to Chichester Harbour to keep water in the harbour the whole time, and there was a road proposed that would go over the top to connect West Wittering to Hayling Island. This is Eleanor Point at West Wittering, and this is a high tide roost, so birds come here to rest when the tide is over the mud. And there was a proposal back in the 1960s to turn all of this into another marina. What if these big projects had been allowed to go ahead? A lot of what makes up the special qualities of Chichester Harbour could have been lost. It was two things that helped to put the brakes on all the development that was taking place in the 1960s. Firstly, the AONB, Area of Outstanding Natural Beauty, designated in 1964. But secondly, the work of just one person, and that was Richard Williamson, because he was the one that raised the profile of this wonderful place with its habitats and wildlife, and raised the concern and the need to start to look after it.
My job was at Kingley Vale. All the time, from the top of the hill, I could see these beautiful little silver inlets of Chichester Harbour. I thought, well, I really want to get involved with that as well, seeing what there was around. I went to the county hall and asked what provision there was for nature conservation. How were the birds being looked after? You know, were they given areas where they could rest and roost? And dear old Tom Beaumont at the county hall said, well, there's no provision at all. This is really a place for the yachtsmen, you see. And I said, well, what about sensitive areas where the birds are nesting, the terns nesting on the sand dunes? Oh, well, we won't get involved with that. We don't want to stop people from going on those Pilsey Islands or any of those sort of places where they like to beach and have a picnic. So I thought the only thing to do is to write a report and present it to them. So I did. I wanted to show them how the whole ecosystem was involved. The mudflats, the Spartina meadows, and the Enteromorpha algal meadows. And I also wanted to show them where the roosts were. Big roost there, Pilsey Island, and breeding areas for birds. So we displayed that at County Hall, and it stopped people in their tracks, put it into people's minds that the harbour was a vitally important place in the chain of estuaries and harbours around the British coast. It's one of the biggest ones. And then the RSPB sort of locked onto this, and they said, this is what we want to do with all the harbours throughout Britain. And from there onwards, they called it the Birds of Estuaries Enquiry. That's how the detailed planning first started.
So in the 1960s, following on from the AONB designation, Richard Williamson's work was significant to what was to follow. Next came the SSSI, that Site of Special Scientific Interest. And initially that was going to be just one small part of Chichester Harbour, and that was Pilsey Island, adjacent to Thorney Island. But with Richard's work, that area was broadened to all of the mud and water area, and the SSSI boundary, designated in 1970, pretty much covers the whole of the harbour shoreline now. Other designations soon followed, and Chichester Harbour became a Ramsar site. Ramsar is a place in Iran where there was a conference, and there was a list made of all the wetlands in the world that were considered to be internationally significant, and Chichester Harbour is on that list. And also for farming, environmental stewardship schemes came into being, and the Conservancy encouraged and worked with local farmers to apply for these schemes.
Over the years, lots of different projects for the protection of nature have taken place, and we're just going to think of 4 of those now. So very early on, Fishbourne Meadows here was taken on by the Conservancy, and the land is actually owned by the council, but it became part of the first projects for environmental stewardship. The reason we look after Fishbourne Meadows is because it is a wetland meadow. And what we do is we let the wildflowers grow, and then cows come in to graze it all off, and that means that the dominant species don't take over, and the wildflowers get a good chance to grow again next year. And our star wildflower here is the southern marsh orchid, and this year we had well over 1,000 of them. So Fishbourne Meadows in the winter time does get quite muddy and wet, but that really is a good thing. It's good news because of managing it as a wetland meadow. And it's October, but already it is starting to get a bit soft, as you can see.
Thornham Point back in the 1980s was just a very ordinary piece of agricultural land. I think it was used for turf production, but then it was subsequently bought by a builder who, although he fortunately went bankrupt, which enabled the Conservancy to buy the land, he left a terrible lot of rubbish on the land itself, including asbestos, which cost the Conservancy really a lot of money to dispose of safely. But when we disposed of it, what we were left with was a very flat, low-lying piece of land with a lot of potential. Well, the next step was to make a plan. And we had a very good friend, Johnny Burgess, who was a coastal engineer, a very good friend to the harbour, who carried out a very detailed survey of Thornham Point, and he calculated exactly the size of the gap that would be necessary to provide the optimum flooding of the land to convert it back into salt marsh. And what you can see behind is the gap, and the bridge which we built. In fact, this is the replacement bridge to the original bridge that we built to enable the footpath to be continuously used. We learned a lot about salt marsh doing this project. We learned that given the right conditions, you can recreate salt marsh, and that was a very valuable lesson to us, because up until that time it was always considered that salt marsh loss could never be regained. But I think with Thornham Point we proved that you could not only recreate salt marsh, you could create new salt marsh too if you allowed the right conditions to prevail. It's difficult to imagine, looking at this lovely salt marsh now, exactly what it looked like back in the 1990s when the Conservancy bought this land, and I think showed great foresight to develop something like this at a time when nobody thought this sort of thing could be done or should be done. So it's a great credit to the Conservancy, and I think after their 50 years people should know about things like this. We're at West Chidham, and this is the site that we hope one day will be a very significant realignment and create quite a considerable area of salt marsh. About 20 years ago, the main footpath, which you can see just alongside the shoreline there, had very badly degraded. We had two choices really. We could repair it because it was potentially quite dangerous in parts. But then when you look at this piece of land, you realise that it at one time was part of the sea. So by returning it to salt marsh, we're really only giving back to the sea what we'd taken from it in the past. So after really quite a lot of consultation, a lot of negotiation, with the support of the church commissioners, the local farmer, the local community, and a very large sum of money from Associated British Ports, work started to build this very impressive bund, which is now the public footpath, and to prepare at some time in the future to breach the original sea wall to create the salt marsh. That is yet to happen. I'm hoping it'll happen sooner rather than later, because this has the potential to be a huge improvement to nature conservation in Chichester Harbour.
Just a few years ago, another project was one here at Cobner Point on the Chiddham Peninsula. As you can see on the seawall, we have the footpath and it's got a lovely surface. It was upgraded so that people who use wheelchairs can come to the harbour shoreline and enjoy the lovely views, as you can see here over the Bosom Channel. Two holes were made in the seawall and bridges have been put across those, but what it's allowed is for the sea to come through into this area on the landward side of the seawall, and that was dug out by diggers, and the plan is for new salt marsh to grow. Some of it's already getting very well established. At the moment the tide is going out and you can probably see the water is flowing out into the main channel. So schemes like this are called managed realignment, and of course what we're allowing here is for salt marsh to grow. There are some species that are called the pioneer species because they're the ones that establish first, and you can see here we have some glasswort. That's a pioneer species. It will come in very quickly and get very well established.
So some of the things that the Chichester Harbour Conservancy are involved in to protect and enhance the habitat for wildlife involve a working group that we're currently calling CHAPRON, which is the Chichester Harbour Protection and Recovery of Nature Group. And that group is a few specialists from different organisations and myself talking about where we can best recover really some of the lost habitats, particularly salt marsh and intertidal mud. And those sorts of issues are really pressing. We've lost a lot of salt marsh and a lot of mud flats over the last 50 or 60 years. We think probably about half of the salt marsh has been lost in Chichester Harbour in that period. So we're looking at places where we might be able to realign the coast and restore those intertidal habitats. We're also looking at how we can restore breeding tern populations to the harbour, and that's pretty complex because they need secure nesting sites, of which we have not very many in the harbour. And one of my roles is to develop places where we can recharge some of the islands that seabirds nest on, the terns and the gulls nest on, and also deploy tern rafts, so artificial nesting rafts, so the terns can have somewhere safe to breed. And that's we've been doing that for 3 years now, but we're now into a sort of a more interesting and long-term phase, and we're looking to really establish a whole network of sites where terns can breed around the harbour.
So next month we're going to be looking at the time of the Heritage Lottery funding. That was 2004 to 2006 and included the Sultan's Way cycle path, which we can see here, which is of course used by so many people now for a lovely cycle ride from Chichester to East Head in West Wittering.